Hi everyone, Rob MaximumRD here. This is a video response, my 2 cents on a video posted by AtariLeaf, MAME versus cart compilations. Is arcade accuracy important? And indeed, I mean, if accuracy is important, then it is great that we have MAME, absolutely. I agree with a lot of his points and what he said, that the enjoyment or the experience of playing games in the arcade is definitely more than the game itself. It's the atmosphere. It's the it's just the whole experience of going to the arcade, standing by your favorite machine. It's the artwork on the machine. It's the control panel. Everything. It's all part of the arcade experience. The ambient sounds in the arcade, from all the other games playing around you to just the sounds of people enjoying the games, so on and so forth. Sadly, that's something, well, in my small Canadian city here in Kelowna, that's pretty much a no-go at all. And it's an experience not to be found. And as many of you know, it's an experience that's getting harder and harder to find at all. It had its time. It was a great time, and unfortunately, it's passed. With the powerful home systems that we have, we can get that. If not the arcade experience itself, at least we can get graphically pretty much perfect representations of the arcade games. As far as accuracy, is accuracy important? Well, I mean, of course, it is important. And again, I can't even imagine not using MAME. It's funny because, I mean, for those of you who use MAME and load up a MAME interface and choose from literally thousands of arcade games to play on your PC, that truly is pretty much graphically one of the best, if not the best, representation you're going to get of any given arcade game. Where a lot of people where they make the mistake is a lot of times people don't know the difference between an emulated game and a port of a game. A port of a game is when any given system or console, whether it be the Atari 2600 to the original 8-bit Nintendo to much more modern systems like the Dreamcast, so on and so forth, a lot of those compilations that they had of those original arcade games are not so much emulation. I mean, some of them were, definitely. But a lot of them are not emulation. They're ports. It's basically taking the existing game as it was in the arcade and porting it to another platform. And the difference being where in an emulator like MAME, or any other given console emulator on your PC, you're emulating the original hardware that game played on. The emulator is doing its best to mimic the original chipset and graphics capability and CPU, etc. of the original arcade hardware. But the ROM that you load onto that is pretty much a complete representation, a complete copy of the original arcade ROM. So when there's differences in the display or the look or how the game performed, that usually comes down to inaccuracies in the arcade emulation of the actual arcade board, system board. And in some cases, when it comes to trying to emulate some of the newer arcade games, you know, you need at least a halfway decent PC. So a lot of the glitches or slowdown or frame rate issues in trying to play those newer arcade games comes down purely to not having a good enough PC to do so. But anyways, yeah, just trying to give you the difference, because I know some people are confused between the differences of emulation and ports. Now, if you want to compare, a good example, of course, are the numerous Street Fighter games that were on the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. Those are really good examples of ports. Those are not the actual arcade games. Those are the arcade games interpreted from the ground up and rebuilt on the hardware of the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis. Sometimes, although the games were originally Capcom arcade games, the developers or studios behind creating those ports can be different. And because of that, sometimes you'll notice some differences between ports, basically. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the reason, obviously, when it comes to older systems like the Atari 2600 and you know, even the Super Nintendo Genesis, Commodore 64, obviously they were not able, in no way were they capable of emulating exact copies of the arcade games as they appeared back in the day. So they did the next best thing they could do, is take the core concept and theme of the original arcade game and adapt it as best they could for any given specific hardware. Obviously, when it came to a lot of the early arcade games, Pac-Man, Defender, Frogger, you know, the classics basically, Centipede, games like that, you know, there's just no way they were going to be represented perfectly on the good old Atari 2600. But I think you'll find with a lot of those games, also like Centipede, Phoenix, you know, a lot of those games, although graphically they weren't even close to the arcade game, they were represented quite well, and that came down to the quality programming and basically, you know, when you played Galaxian or Centipede or Phoenix or, you know, Defender, you felt like you were playing that game. It had the same feel to it. It had the same play mechanics. And then you had ports that were famously poor in comparison, like the often picked on Pac-Man. Which brings me to what I think will probably be the wrap-up here. As far as accuracy goes, is that important? As I said again, sure, it's important. If I want a perfect graphical representation or the closest representation of an arcade game that I can get in my home, surely I'll just load up MAME. It's a great emulator, and it's very capable of emulating a variety of hardware and arcade boards, and therefore the games that originally ran look pretty close to the original and play pretty much like the original in most cases. With that, you know, you can add the artwork, you can look at information of the game, you can see the original flyer. This is all if you happen to set up MAME in a way that you have all the extra features like the artwork and brochures and the art bevels and so on. That's probably the best way you're going to do it. But again, as far as accuracy goes, when it comes to compilations on cartridge, or even, you know, compilations on even some of the early CD-based gaming systems, quite often, the accuracy wasn't there, and but the thing is, going back to the Pac-Man on 2600 example, while that may not have been a very good representation of the original arcade game, and while many people hated it because they were expecting Atari to bring a very faithful conversion home to the Atari 2600, and plugging in that cartridge for the first time was quite shocking to a lot of people. But as much as a lot of people hated it for that specific reason, there's a lot of people I've heard and read and seen comments that enjoyed Pac-Man on the 2600. They actually liked it, not because it was a very good representation of the original arcade game, but for the game that it was. How can I explain? So a lot of games that, let's say, were not perfect representations on the Commodore 64, the 2600, the Intellivision, for sure the VIC-20, systems like that. A lot of those games that were maybe reminiscent of those games by title only, and maybe a little bit of the core gameplay mechanics, even though they were not perfect representations, they were just good games in their own right. They stood on their own. They were still fun to play. You still felt like you were, I guess, in the world of that game. And maybe you had to use your imagination a little more. But although they may not have had the arcade accuracy of the original games, a lot of those games on the systems that couldn't recreate them exactly as they were back in the day, they were still fun in their own right. So that's why a lot of us, especially some of the older crowd among us who lived through these generations of home consoles and systems, and played a lot of these so-called arcade ports, we enjoyed them a lot. We had a ton of fun with them. We go back to a lot of them. And again, where they may not have had every level, they may not have had as many, as high resolution or the same graphics or the same amount of colors, they were just fun and good on their own. They stood on their own. So yeah, I think, especially with the current generation and the younger generation today, to look at some of these early examples of arcade ports, you would think, oh God, they're just horrible. But if you actually pick them up and play them, and just enjoy them for what they were, and just experience them on their own, judge them on their own merits, I think you'll find that a lot of those inaccurate games were actually very fun to play and stood the test of time and stood on their own, stood up on their own merits, so to speak. So yeah, that's, I just felt like adding a little bit to AtariLeaf's original video. There'll be a link in the description as always. So that's it. Thanks for listening to my babbling on once again. And Maximum RD out. Bye for now.